Hello and welcome back to Happy Stitching from Magic Hour Cross Stitch Supplies. I'm Donna.
And I'm Serena.
And we're a mother-daughter team that are really into cross stitch. So we are here today. Then we're going to address something that we haven't had time for the last few episodes, and that is answering some questions from people that have emailed me or have addressed us through our Facebook page.
From viewers just like you.
That's right. Okay, so let's get right to it. While we're answering questions, by the way, we are continuing to work on our projects. I'm still back stitching spider legs, if you would know that if you listened to our last podcast, trying to get my Halloween picture done in time for this to be turned into a trick-or-treat bag. So I'm using some bright red étoile floss, and I'm using it for back stitch to see how it would work, and it's working really well. You can see the little sparkles there on my spider legs. So I'm really happy with the result. Serena, what are you working on?
For those of you who have been following my saga, I have been working on this pair of little heart hands, as I call it. It's just a little outline of some hearts, sort of a Mickey Mouse type shape. Hands, sort of a Mickey Mouse type thing with some red in the middle, working on some étoile. And for those of you who know, I was doing them on a 32 count linen 1/1, which I made a whoopsie last week. And so I decided this week that I would start it again on 14 count using 2 strands of étoile. And this is going to be a gift, not sure what I'm going to turn it into yet, for my aunt.
Okay. And how is that working on the 14 count now?
Much better.
Yeah?
I'm still using the tapestry needle, which I like because it's very exact.
That tiny little petite?
Yep.
Yeah, I like those too. And tell me about that hoop you got there.
It's a spring tension hoop, which is good for higher counts, because it's what I brought in today. It's good for the higher counts, because it really grabs a hold, because it's kind of not the spring is sort of the whole hoop, and it sort of wedges in between, wedges the fabric in between a little divot in the hoop and the spring. So it's good for the higher counts because it holds it really tight.
Mm-hmm.
But because the higher counts are so fine and such thin fabric, it's a little bit difficult to use on the thicker fabrics. So if you hear a sudden boing, you know what happened.
So it's good on high counts, but on this 14, it's a little more difficult?
It's a little more difficult to use, yeah.
I see.
Well, not use, but have it keep in place.
Oh, I see.
And especially if you're trying to go over, trying to put it through. You had this problem when we did the workshop. Mm-hmm. The only hoop we had was my tension hoop, and you tried to do it with your groovy, and it kept going spring.
That's right, I remember, because the groovy was already stitched, so it was even thicker. Well, if you want to change, we do have a 6-inch hoop over here, the regular kind.
Okay.
But we are going to be talking about hoops and Q-snaps and scroll frames, oh my, in a future podcast. So I appreciate the input on those spring hoops. I do enjoy using a hoop from time to time and alternating with my Q-snap. So we'll talk about that in another one. But let's get right to some questions here.
You haven't had time for questions for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, so they're kind of piling up. We'll hope to get through a few of them today. First question is from Greg in Tacoma, Washington, and he wants to know how to pick your first color when you're starting a new pattern. So that is another area where personal preference comes a lot into play, but there are some guidelines that you can use to decide. So it depends on what kind of stitching you do. Some people do cross country. I'm talking about bigger patterns now. Some people do cross country, and those people, that I am one of them, start generally in the middle. And other people do a parking method, and they start page by page, usually in the upper left or bottom corner, in a corner anyway. And so your color choice would depend on where you want to start. What kind of stitching do you do, Serena? You start in the middle?
When I do bigger projects, I start in the middle. But when I do like smaller projects like this one, I tend to start in a corner. I like starting in a corner. It's an old habit that kind of dies hard with me.
From when you stitched on plastic canvas when you were little?
No, from when I stitched on 14 count plastic canvas to make those magnets I talked about last week.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay, so how to pick your first color. As a cross-country stitcher, I like to start in the center. Now, cross-country is just means that I don't do page by page. I usually, generally, the big picture, I use start in the center and work my way out. So my first color is usually whatever is the color in the center.
But what if that color is a background color? You can't do background first. It's utter madness.
Or sometimes there's no stitch there.
Right.
So, or it's like a fractional or something. You don't really want to start with a fractional. I like to do those, well, just to give it some structure. So, okay, first, what's cross-country stitching? That's when for me, I like to do a color at a time. So I will use a two highlighter method on my pattern, and I'll take my yellow highlighter and I find what is the stitch in the very center. We'll assume at first that there is one, and I will highlight that one and mark which one is the center, because it's easy to lose it in the crowd if there are lots of that color around. And then I will highlight all the stitches in that color that are not too far scattered. So if there are like way out there, there's some few, then I would leave those. But all the main patches or areas that have that color, I would highlight those stitches, and I would do all of those stitches at one go. So I often have 3 or 4 needles all threaded up and ready to go at the same time. Because once I get stitching, I like to just stitch. I don't like the distraction of having to change threads and stuff. So I just thread up a bunch of needles at a time. And so I will start with the center and work my way out. At the very beginning, for cross-country stitching, it's very important to count correctly, because if you get out of count at the beginning, the whole thing's going to be out. And that's why gridding is really helpful, particularly for cross-country.
But we'll talk about that next week.
And again, that's another subject for another podcast, right? So I will, so then I would just do all of those stitches, and then as I go, I highlight those stitches with the pink highlighter to show which ones are stitched and which ones are not. So the not ones would be yellow and the pink stitched ones would be pink, or orange actually. And that works really well for me. And then I move on to another color that's somewhere in the same vicinity, so that I can use those stitches and the grid lines to reference where to place my next stitches. And then I just go on like that. And I find that really helpful. It's not foolproof, of course. There are no foolproof methods of never making a mistake for cross-stitching. Every cross-stitcher makes mistakes. So the trick is to catch them as soon as possible and be able to correct mistakes as they happen. So gridding, that's another advantage of gridding, is that it helps you catch mistakes quickly.
Can you put those scissors in the middle? Because
where did your scissors go?
They're here, but they're terrible.
Oh, those little ones. Yeah, those are ancient.
Yes, they are. Yeah. And they've been used to cut like plastic and stuff.
They're just little snips from the dollar shop.
No, they're from Fabricland, but
are they?
They're like 8 years old.
Yeah, they're pretty old. We have better scissors. I don't know why we keep using terrible ones, but that's just what happens. I've got the good ones put away for cutting fabric. That's why. Anyway. So that is how I pick my first color. Now, Serena, you said you start in a corner or in some other area. So how do you pick your first color?
Well, I pick whatever color is close to that corner.
And which corner do you decide? Does it just depend on the picture?
It's usually either the left, upper, or lower corner.
Oh, okay.
Depends whatever's closest to the edge.
Oh, so you like to stitch left to right kind of thing? Oh. I actually do have a preference too. I like to go top to bottom whenever possible. But, sometimes just go bottom to top, but it doesn't really matter.
Well, it's easier for me to go left to right because I tend to hold my project upside down.
Oh, I do that too if I'm back stitching or something.
No,
you
not
don't
back
need to see a
stitching, just
picture.
all the time.
Really?
Yeah.
That's
I know, it's really weird.
well, I wasn't going to say really weird, but, if you say it, it's okay. Well, everybody's got their own ways, right? There's as many different ways to stitch as there are stitchers. So that's the fun part of being a stitcher. Is you don't have to be the same as everybody else, which is a good thing because we're not. Okay, if that about covers it. I'm sure there are other ways of knowing what color to pick first. And if you're a parker instead of a cross-countryer, then you might have a different method. You'd probably just start in the whatever corner that you like. And I don't do parking, so I'm not really familiar with it. But I know that you do like pick a 10 patch or a 20 square patch, and you do all the colors of that thread in that patch, and then you park that thread and move on to the next. So it's a pretty much totally different method of stitching, and we can explore that maybe in a video because it really needs a visual to explain how that works, and that'll be a future project for us to do. Okay, let's move on to another question. Serena, would you like to read this one?
This is from Judy from Devon, Alberta, and it says how to select a fabric.
Okay, how do you select the fabric? Well, how do you select your fabric, Serena?
With your help. I'm not very good at math or counting, so I say what fabric works for this. I tend to use hand dyes, so I usually pick whatever colors go to the fabric and whatever is big enough for my fabric, big enough or small enough, depending on the fabric.
Oh, so
tiny coverage again. There we go.
So whatever is available, basically.
Yeah, basically.
So, but if you were doing a bigger, more complex, more involved project, you might want to put a little more thought into your fabric.
Yeah, like the rolling mat. Not.
Oh, right.
For dice, don't worry, for dice. The rolling mat project, I went through several iterations of what fabric to use for that.
That's right. Why don't you tell our listeners what you're talking about?
Well, I found a pattern on Pinterest and then bought it on Etsy, as you're supposed to do. And
what is this rolling mat?
It's for dice. For when you play Dungeons and Dragons, it'll have a cord around the outside so your dice don't fall everywhere.
And the picture?
It's 2 dragons in a D20. That's a 20-sided dice. Yes, I have those. And underneath it says Carpe Diem, like the letters DM, which stands for Dungeon Master.
And that's going to be for
my sister. It was supposed to be a birthday present. Now we'll just give it to her whenever it's done.
Right. So when Serena's sister comes to visit, she lives in Toronto, we live in Niagara. When she comes to visit, we do play Dungeons and Dragons, and Okami is our dungeon master. So that was why Serena picked that project. It's a very cool project, and we picked. Tell about the fabric that you're stitching on.
I'm stitching on a hand-dyed 14 count, so it's large enough, and it's kind of a fire type, fire look. so we had to change the color of the dragons.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of them was like a brown, I think. I don't remember. So we changed it to green. So it's kind of a Lord of the Rings reference, sort of a green dragon.
Right? That sounds perfect. That's going to be so cool when that's done.
When it's eventually finished.
Oh, it will be. It will be. I know you got caught up with other stuff, and that's what happens. That's how people end up with 50 projects on the go. But anyway, it does bring up a good point of how do you know what fabric to pick. And one of the first things that you have to decide is you look at the pattern and you get the stitch count. There will be a recommendation for your fabric, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do that fabric. The main thing the first question I should say that you have to answer is, how big do you want your finished project?
And what are you going to do with it?
And what are you going to do with it? So in this case, it's going to be a used thing. So it's not just going to be framed and sit on the wall. It's going to be actually in use. So you want a fabric that will be quite sturdy, because she'll be rolling it up and taking it over to her friend's house and such. So a 14 count is a good choice for that. And we had some good sturdy 14s in stock. So we used one of those. So the count of your fabric is the main parameter, you might say, that decides the size of your finished project. So if you have, say, 100 by 100 stitch pattern, that's not that big. That's mid or small size.
Really small?
Yeah.
We have different versions of the word small.
I guess we do. Then on a 32 count, it's going to be very tiny. On a 14 count, it'll be quite large. So a 14 count means that it has 14 stitches per inch. So for 100 square pattern would be 100 divided by 14, which I didn't calculate ahead of time, but it's roughly 6.5. So your project will come out about 6.5 inches square. But on, say, 28 count, it's only going to be like 4 inches square, a little bit smaller, a little smaller than 4 inches. So it makes a huge difference. Now, you have to keep in mind, though, that if you're going to stitch over 2, then a 28 count would yield the same size pattern as a 14 count, because you're using the stitches, you're doing 2 stitches for every, 2 threads for every stitch. So it comes out to be the same as 14 count if you're using a 28 count over 2. And the same with 32 count, if you're putting it over 2, then you do your calculations for 16 count. So that's the first thing you have to think about. What size do you want your finished project to be? Once you decide that, then you can look at your fabric options. So an Ada is a really nice all-purpose fabric, especially if you're going to be doing like a full coverage or almost full coverage, or if you're using a hand dyed. So my own personal preference is I don't like, especially on the 14 count, the background, unstitched background, if it's just plain white, it looks quite textured. So if I'm going to frame that picture, I would want to cover up the empty white. So either with getting a hand-dyed fabric to make it a really beautiful background, or even a solid color even. Or I would choose a finer fabric like Lugana or linen. And we can get the same stitch calculations, the same sized finished project as we talked about a minute ago with the Luganas and linens, just by stitching over 2. So you have flexibility in how big your project is, and you have the fine fabric background on the unstitched portions. Now, if it's full coverage, that doesn't really matter, but you could still choose any kind of fabric that you like and just calculate it out with number of stitches and divided by the count. So that is how you select fabric. You decide how big of a project you want it to be, and what it's going to be when it's finished. So if it's going to hang on the wall, you'll want a finer fabric. If it's going to be in use, then you might want a sturdier fabric. But you can still make a pillow out of a Lugana or a linen. Whatever you want to do.
Very carefully.
Not only carefully, but it helps to put the interfacing on the back, the iron-on interfacing when you're finished.
We talked about that last week too.
Yes, we did. We touched on that. And when I finish this picture and I get to turn it into the trick-or-treat bag, we can walk through that with me as I do that. That'll be fun. And so, Greg, I hope that, that was Judy.
Yes.
Judy, I hope that answers your question about how to choose your fabric. Okay, let's move on to the next question. But first, Serena, do you have a preference in what fabric that you like to use?
I like higher counts.
Of what?
Fabric.
Of linen or Lugana?
I've never stitched on the Lugana. I want to, but I never have before.
Okay. Well,
I've done the linen, and I've done Ada, I've done hand-dyed Ada, but never Lugana.
Okay. Well, we'll have to get you a piece of Lugana to try out. We have tons of little scraps and pieces around, so you could just pick one and try it out for your size, see how you like it. I like Lugana. I've stitched on all three of those main kinds of cross-stitch fabrics. And I like all of them. I'm probably not as big a fan of linen as I am of the others.
What did you stitch on linen?
I was stitching I was doing that Irish Celtic cross on linen.
On black linen?
No, it was kind of a natural brown linen.
Why do I keep thinking it was black linen?
I don't know. It's not black. I don't think I've stitched on black linen. But I like linen for the appearance of the finished project, but I find it harder to find the holes. Now, that could just be
hard to find the holes.
It is. But it's probably just a case of getting used to it, and I can certainly see why people who love linen love linen. But I also really like the Lugana, because it does have a very fine appearance when on the finished project, on the unstitched parts.
But the holes are much bigger, aren't they?
The holes are much bigger, and they're more evenly spaced.
Right.
So you don't have the slubs and stuff that you see in the linen. So I find it easier to stitch on.
Mm-hmm.
I have had people say that they didn't like the Lugana because it wasn't a sturdy fabric, like the edge is frayed and the threads moved around and like that. But I think that would also be something that you just get used to. I've never found that with Lugana.
Really?
No, I haven't had any trouble sewing on it, and I like it. But I think my favorite is still Ada. I really like Ada. It's a simple, straightforward kind of fabric, and I can pick it up anytime. It comes in so many gorgeous colors.
It does. We just got in some nice pink and yellow recently.
That's right, we did. And that ice blue is so pretty. It's a very pale blue, but it's really lovely. I could see why they call it ice blue. It does make me feel cold just looking at it. That it does have so many colors. And we also got in, did I tell you that we got our Confederation Gray?
Really?
And our Celadon. So we're expanding our color range for our shop, and they're all so pretty. And Ada is just so simple to use.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't done a lot of like really fancy, complicated, detailed designs lately. I've done quite a few simple, straightforward type. So
that sampler wasn't straightforward.
Which one?
The sampler?
Oh yeah, the sampler. That was good. I really enjoyed that. That was 28 count Monaco over 1. That was the mystery sampler that went around Yeah, I did the 2017 one, and it was my very first sampler. So sampler isn't a kind that I have done a lot of, but now I really like them. So I would definitely do more of those. It was just a really big one. So I did it over 28 count over one, because if I'd chosen an Ada, even an 18 count Ada, it would have been like 5 feet long. And then I wouldn't be able to afford to frame it. So I got the 28 count, so it brought it down to a size that I could manage. And I found a really nice frame and everything. I just haven't got around to the framing.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'll do that for myself for Christmas. Yeah, that would be a good thing for me to do. Anyway, so I hope that answers the question of how to select a fabric. We talked about that already. Now we're on to a new question. This one is from Cindy in Rochester, New York. And Cindy wants to know, how do I know how much fabric I need? So it's kind of a related question, and that's a very good question, Cindy. So first you have to answer the other questions from Judy about how to select a fabric. So you first have to answer, what kind of fabric are you going to stitch on? So once you have that, then you can do your calculations of how much fabric that you need. So you need to find the information of, so you can, when I say calculate, don't get afraid of that. It's a very simple little equation.
I'm already terrified.
You don't have to be, sweetie. That's why I'm here. I do your calculations for you. But it is pretty easy for those who are not number challenged. And here's how you do it. You get your design size. So write down the width number and the height number. So you need to figure out both. Then you divide that.
Which shouldn't that say on the pattern?
It will definitely say on the pattern. It'll say either design area or stitch count or something like that. You don't have to go by their recommendation on the pattern. It may be right, but then you're stuck with the fabric and count that they also recommend. So if you want to make your own decisions in that regard, then it's still easy to figure out how much fabric you need. So you need the stitch count or design size in the two directions. And if some patterns don't have that somewhere clear, but you can always just look at the pattern and count. They're usually written out, the numbers of columns and that are written there. Wow. Just look and see how big your pattern is. Write down the numbers. Okay, now you take each of those. Say we'll start with the width. You take the width, say it's 320 stitches across. You divide that by the count of your fabric. So if you're stitching on 32 count fabric, 320 stitches will be 10 inches. If you're stitching on 32 count over 2, then that would be the same as 16 count, because you're using up 2 of the threads per stitch, so it makes it the same as 16 count. That would be 20 inches. Or if you're just using a 16 count Ada, you'd need 20 inches. That's the width. And you just do the same calculation for the height. Now 14 count will be a little bit bigger than that. And if you're using a very fine linen, like a 48 count or something?
40 count.
40 count, it would be a little bit smaller, the finished project, I mean. So you divide your design size number by the count of your fabric, and round up. It's not usually an exact number, so just round up. And then you have to consider, what is your margin going to be? That would be the unstitched part of your fabric around the design size. So you need that part for the framer to be able to stretch your fabric as he or she is framing it. So you need usually 3 inches is recommended. You can get by with less, but 3 inches is comfortable. Some people prefer the 4 inches. You just have to decide which one, and that whichever way you like to go is fine. But add it on both sides. So if you have a 3-inch margin on a 10-inch, you need 10 inches of fabric for the design. You want a 3-inch margin. You have to add 6 inches. So you have 3 inches on each side. Otherwise, you're going to end up with only an 1.5 inch margin. That makes it more difficult for the framing. So now you've got a 16-inch piece of fabric wide according to your calculations of your design. So I hope that helps you figure out how much fabric you need. And if you need help with that, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help you walk you through that calculation and help you find the perfect piece of fabric for your project. I love doing that. That's one of my favorite things. So please feel free to contact me, and we'll go over that contact information again at the end, which is coming up right away. So you can email me at donna@magichourcrossstitchsupplies.com, and you can find me on Facebook too at facebook.com/magichourcrossstitch. And remember to check out our website. I would love to see you there. It's magichourcrossstitchsupplies.com. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll join us again where we'll answer some more questions and have some other interesting topics to discuss while we stitch away at our own projects. So thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you again later. I'm Donna.
I'm Serena.
Happy stitching!